Welcome to Pamana, where we journey into the heart of the Ateneo Library of Women's Writings, ALiW, a living archive of voices, stories, and memories. Here, heritage isn't simply preserved, it flourishes through the words of Filipino women whose lives and legacies shape our collective identity. In each episode, we explore the Pamana, or legacy embodied in ALiW's collection. We uncover the histories, narratives, and works that generations of Filipino women have entrusted to the nation, and the ways we can honor, protect, and celebrate their pamana. Today, I bring you a fascinating episode titled Desperately Seeking Women. This episode draws from the insightful conversation that took place on November 20, 2024 at the Ateneo Library of Women's Writings between two remarkable scholars who have done extensive research on women, Dr. Vina Lanzona from the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and Dr. Catherine Lacson from Ateneo de Manila University. Together, they explore the importance of archives in uncovering women's stories, stories that are often hidden, overlooked, or fragmented. Dr. Lanzona's work has brought to life the revolutionary women of the Hook Rebellion, while Dr. Lacson has delved into the identities of women during the American period. Today, we'll listen to how these scholars pursued women's histories and the archival materials that help them piece their narratives that have been lost to history. Let's start with Dr. Vina Lanzona, historian and the author of Amazons of the Hook Rebellion. Her search for the stories of revolutionary women within the Hook Rebellion has a long history, one that also took inspiration from a more contemporary revolution.
Kasi it was still the time of the end of martial law, di ba? Yung parang during the time of Ninoy Aquino. But I was still in high school. Tapos in college was the time when Cory Aquino became president, and we were all involved. And the students are so active, diba, under martial law. And then I was part of an organization here called Linga Bilanggo, which was a kind of group for political detainees. So we were so invested with the end of martial law and people power like that. So after college, I went to actually work for Cory Aquino's government, and I was in the office of the Peace Commissioner, and we're so involved because I was very involved with parang peace situation, parang insurgency. It's something that I was always a bit obsessed with revolution, which in the end is something that I developed in my work, right? So, but after 2 years of being at the Peace Commissioner, of the Office of the Peace Commissioner, I decided, I'm a little bit disillusioned with the government, because we all know that it wasn't a social revolution really, so it was kind of still the same issues. So I said, I want to study abroad, so that's when I went abroad and studied and went first to at the New School for Social Research in New York, which was a kind of radical, left-wing university school, because I wanted something, I don't want mainstream programs. But at the New School, my first major paper, I think it was my thesis. I have this professor who was my advisor, who was an expert in mobilizations and revolutions. And so he said, why don't you write something about a revolution in the Philippines, right? For most historians, they were always obsessed with the 1896 revolution, diba? Because it's our national revolution, our first major revolution against a colonial power, against Spain. Tapos we got our independence. Tapos then people love to study about Jose Rizal or Andres Bonifacio. So I was kind of heading towards there, and then I said, wait a minute, there is another rebellion that I learned, pero very briefly lang in college, They didn't really teach us so much about the Hope Rebellion, but I was a bit familiar with it, I think si Jojo was my teacher, was my professor in college. So, and then I think she talked to us about it, but not too much, right? So I said, I'm going to study this rebellion. I'm going to study about the Hope Rebellion, and I'm going to read everything I want to read about the Hope Rebellion. So I started this whole project on the Hope Rebellion. I mean, I'm assuming maybe you guys have more of a background of what the rebellion is, right? It started during the Japanese occupation. It was communist. It was led by the Communist Party, and then they continued after liberation, right? So there are two phases of the Hope Rebellion. So one of the first things that I did was to look at Politburo documents, because it was led by, because this is when Christians ask question about where are the women, right? So first thing, because many of the leaders of the rebellion were imprisoned, and the Politburo is political bureau, which means that it's the policy making organ of this movement. So when they were arrested, the leaders, they were able to capture all these documents, Politburo documents, right? So I was looking at the Politburo documents to just kind of, usually when you're studying revolutions or rebellions or movements, the major questions are always, why did it fail? If it's a failure, right? So understanding, the dynamics of movements, to understand why was it successful or why did it fail. So that was what I was also going to think about, what happened to the Hope Rebellion. I wanted to really get into, so that's why I looked into the Politburo documents. So, but when I looked at the Politburo documents, I was able to see all these documents about sex problem or baby problem. So, in fact, the most fascinating document that I saw was this document entitled "Revolutionary Solution to the Sex Problem," right? Yeah, which is actually in my book, which I try to reproduce because it's so fascinating to just actually read that document. And then I also read another document talking about the family problem, right? And then I came across another document which says the baby problem. And I said, they're talking about sex, family, baby, without talking about the women, right? If there's a problem about sex or babies or family, then for sure there are women in this movement, right? So I read everything about the Hope Rebellion, and there's hardly any mention of women, right? Most of the works on the Hope Rebellion were just mostly about the leadership. Tapos there were many people na part of the leadership who were actually published their memoirs like that, right? So, and I sort of looked, and there's, maybe Luis Tarroco was the leader of the Hope Rebellion. He published two biographies, right? One is actually ghostwritten by William Pomeroy, but then he mentioned maybe twice the whole time about a woman, right? And then Pomeroy, of course, also published his own memoir, and he talked about his wife. But so there are bits and pieces of like mentions of women, but looking at the documents, right, you see that why are they talking about sex? Why are they talking about family? Why are they talking about baby without talking about women? So this is really became my goal. I'm going to find these women, because if there are all these documents about women, for sure there'll be a lot of women.
Dr. Lacson also shares her journey as a historian, one that comes from a place that challenges the dominance of women in various spaces. Let us hear Dr. Lacson's account of how women became an integral part of her research.
I don't think I'll be able to explain how I ended up here if I don't go back. Medyo may magawa, nostalgic for a moment, no? I came from a time wherein women were, kahit na parang ba, hindi pa naman siya ganun kaluma, pero hindi rin siya ganun kabago, no? Na parang, feeling ko kasi nung bata pa lang ako, I always took on positions that men took. Parang sabi ko, kalmado na ako ngayong feminista, pero dati talaga, na parang I really wanted, like for example, during our time there was the OCC, stuff like that. Sabi na, hindi pwedeng yung babae maging COC, COIC. Yun ang pinatali ako. Alam mo yun yung parang sabi ko, ako yung pinakaunang COC, COIC. I always try to revamp na parang, hindi pwede babae ha. Kukunin ko yung position na yan. So I always went for leadership positions. Huminga na lang ako nung after my 30s, ganyan. But before, like, when I went into SEAP, it's an ambassador thing. Walang babae pang youth leader. Ako mag-youth leader. Alam mo yun, kasi parang sa kanya na parang, because you always seem to see that, pag ganun mga posisyon, lahat babae. So parang, I was all, kaya pagod na ako, ayoko na ng posisyon ngayon. No, but kasi,
You've done your tour.
kasi the thing is, it's exhausting. Because you're always fighting against a wave. And dati talaga, I don't even stop. Parang lahat ng pwedeng debatihan, babae yan, driver, aawayin ko. I mean, I really was like that. Ibang-iba naman yun, kalmado na. No? But I think that's it. That is where, first, I think, my idea of having to be able to give voice to women started. It started actually with, I would always say, I practice it, then maybe I need to write it. Parang ganyan, diba? So, it was that. It was finding all of these places where, bakit yung babae hindi pasok doon? And I always would try to, talaga, papasok ako doon. So, that was what happened. And with history, bata pa lang ako yung pinaglalaban ng quiz bee. Yung di ba I'm sure lahat kayo, di ba? May ganyan, di ba? Tayo
Ano yun, parang battle of the brains.
Oo, araling panlipunan, regional,
Spelling bee,
national.
spelling bee.
Yan, yun ang mga labanan, di ba? I'm sure some of you can relate to that, no? So, and it only
Oo,
stopped.
mga Atenista yan eh.
I'm sure they can relate to that, no? So, it was always that. It was always part and parcel of my life. And then what happened was, I went to college. One of the things that I wanted to be doing film. So I was in comm. That was my undergrad. I'm a comm student. So I did everything. Ganyan, no? Parang, so that's why, ito yung background ko. Ganyan, no? And then after comm, I became a comm practitioner. I did theater. I was with PETA. I was with Musical Theater Philippine, so Celeste Legacies. And the thing is, those plays that we were doing were theatrical plays. With Musical Theater Philippines, we were doing Rizal. I was one of the girls. Ganyan, of Rizal, di ba? Ganyan. Ay, hindi daw ako pa Maria Clara. Actually, I was Lisa. It's funny, but it's true. I thought na ganyan, hindi ako pa Maria Clara eh. So, role ko palagi Sisa, ganyan. Sisa ang role ko, no? Or, I would have, a place ko would always be historical, in nature, no? PETA. I was with PETA. Again, it will always be about issues with women, etc., etc. Even the, si Brett ba yun? I can't remember the play. Again, it was about women. So the Caucasian Chalk Circle, I think if you remember that play, right? So parang all the things that I were doing were actually basically about women without me really realizing that maybe I was attracting it or I was really going for it. So yun yung mundo ko. And then at the same time, after graduating from COM, I started doing documentaries. So, hindi ko napansin na almost all my documentaries were historical in nature. I did with Noel Rodriguez, Jose Rizal ang buhay ng isang biyani. So, may isang kulot doon, kinukuha rin kaming extra dahil kulang ang budget, di ba? So, ganyan, di ba? So, that was that. And then I was part of Batas Militar. I was part of that group as well with Cara Magsano. And then, after that, I had other historical documentary. So, buhay sa akin yung mga yan. Kasi when we did Jose Rizal, we were with Father Joey, we went into the National Library, lumalabas yung mga edad talaga. And then tawag dito, and then inilabas talaga sa harap namin yung lahat ng mga trabaho ni Rizal. Hinawakan talaga namin yung mga may ultimo adios niya. So, it was very much alive for me. So, it was only a matter of time before Dr. Totanes, because I was doing a lot of work for history during the time. I was helping out with the 1896 Tertulia. I know what, naman a Tertulia, right? No? So I helped out with that. I helped out Noel with her Lasoli, trying to get all the writers to. Ako yung assistant ni Noel. Ayan, ganyan. Ako yung assistant ni Noel. So it was that. And then before you know it, parang I took an MS in Information Management. I was actually coding. And tapos I had to say no to a play by Envy and Gonzalez with PETA because I couldn't, because I was doing information management. You know that, we're the same. So parang sabi kong ganyan, na parang, ano ginagawa ko? Nagko-code ako, nagja-Java ako. At what am I doing here? Diba? Tapos parang, and a friend of mine sent me to a project. Tapos parang sabi ko ganyan, sabi, hindi marketing. Sabi ko, matagal na ako hindi nagma-market research. Because comment, di ba? We know how to do market research. So sabi ko, ang ginagawa ko na ngayon is historical research. Tapos may hakatabi akong Java program.
May Java pa ba?
Wala na.
Meron pa.
Siya yung back-end. Sabi niya. So, ayun, then sabi niya, alam mo, then I was telling her about history. And then sabi niya, dapat mag-history ka. And then when I was actually presenting my tawag dito, Revalida for multimedia com during that time, hinihingi na yung number ko ng mga nakaupo kasi kailangan nila noong content director for their CD-ROM. Lumalabas ang edad. CD-ROM. Okay, so ganyan, di ba? So it was only a matter of time before I found myself going to the history department because almost all my projects were like that. No? I also worked under Direk Maria Montelibano, who were also doing a lot of documentaries with the Spanish Embassy, etc. So yung buhay ko talaga, makulay kumukutita. Talagang but com actually led me back to history. Kaya I remember when I was applying for a scholarship for my master's, si Father Joey nag-interview, so what will you do with your com? Sabi ko, well, look at it this way, sabi ko, my com will now be the content of what I'll be writing in history. And that's what happened, right? And so when I was doing my master's, I was really focused on actually doing theater history. Because I was doing theater. Tapos sabi ko nga lahat ng ginawa ko yun before. Nag-teatro talaga ako. So I was doing theater history. Sabi ko, sundan natin si Ma'am Doreen. Ganyan. Di ba yun yung dream, no? And then, si Doc Dialogo, yung supervisor ko, talagang hot off the presses, biglang sabi, kasi si Doc A, si Doc Aguilar, tsaka si Doc G was saying, you have to find the new space. Yun nga, parang ikaw na hindi naman dapat puro Spanish period, etc., etc. So parang bigla ako nag-isip na, wait, I was with Han Erickson. Dami kong ginawa sa buhay ko. Dami ko ginawa sa buhay ko. So sabi ko, I know advertising. And nobody has ever written about ads during that time. I was the first one to write about it. So yun ginawa ko. And then sabi ko, when I was going through that, I said, you know what, I'll go back to what was close to my heart, which was about women. So I ended up, sabi ko, advertising, very much connected. Yeah, there's masculinities, etc. But a lot of the advertising is actually connected to women. So I decided, wala pang gumagawa nito. So, sige, American period tayo, ganyan. But before that, ang first love ko was martial law, because that was my documentary. And then before that was Spanish period. Tapos umikot yan because I was also part of the documentary Siglo Filipino. I was the research director for that one. So I researched the whole darn thing. So it's 100 years of Philippine history. So talagang yung foundation ko, parang pwede ko sa inyong itapon lahat ito yung sources. Ganyan, di ba ito? Kasi ako yung pumupunta talaga at kinukuha yun. So, pinagsama-sama na hindi ko in-expect, ang pinaka hindi ko love was American period.
And yet.
Kaya sabi ko, parang hindi niya pwedeng isara yung utak niyo doon sa ano. Kasi inikot ko kasi talagang dati nagdala ko Rizal. Rizal lang tayo. Tapos biglang napunta ako, Japanese occupation. Kasi talagang love ko. Tapos si Mang Lydia was helping out. And then matas militar. Talagang tinatanong ko yung American period. Ayoko ng American period. Ayoko talaga. Ganyan. And then what happened was, after masters, sabi ko, gusto ko lang talagang magturo ng isang taon tapos titigil na ako. Kasi I want to go back to my work, which is com, no? 13 years later, I'm still here. Okay, so may ganon, no? So, along the way, habang nandun ako, umupo sa thesis ko was si Ma'am Kamagay. And then si Ma'am Kamagay was saying, nakakaloka, diba? Okay, so parang sabi niya, I think you should continue this. Because I was talking, because nobody's ever done this. And even during the time, I was already doing big data when there was no computer to do big data with. Because it's advertisements, number of those, I learned how to do random sampling. Because at the start, ito na, balik na tayo sa women, no? Parang at the start, parang hindi ko mahanap yung mga kababaihan. And parang sabi ko nga, as a com student, I ended up utilizing something that was very common. Newspapers. And ads. So, nandun nanggagaling yung background ko. So, when I said na parang, dali lang bilang, habang nire-research mo sila, hanapin mo sila, makikita mo sila, pero nakatago sila eh. They're not necessarily in the front page.
From their accounts, we heard how women weren't even their primary research, yet by virtue of their continued exposure to various archival materials, they increasingly saw the lack of representation of women in history. As Dr. Lanzona notes,
As a woman's historian, and I'm sure Kate will talk about it too, parang we always want to recover their voices. Kasi as we all know, women have always been kind of marginalized, especially in Philippine history, right? You know, in fact, my paper in the ALiWW conference is to kind of talk about why women are marginalized, and I'll talk about textbooks and how they talk about women in textbooks and all that, right? You know, kasi it's always been a kind of separate section na, okay, women's stuff, this is what women did. But the way that we think about history is always with the framing of a kind of male-dominated history, right? So that's why this question of how do we find women is really important, because you have to be really innovative and creative in recovering these women's voices, right?
It is from here that we listen to their strategies in finding women in their research. For Dr. Lenzona, it meant going to different parts of the world after seeing some of these women's names in the Politburo.
So first thing I did was to try to find a woman. So the very first woman I talked to was actually the woman who was part of the Politburo, Celia Mariano. So she was already in her 80s, but she was still so smart, and she was in prison for 10 years, right? So I mean, the thing about these Hope women is that they were really very much involved in these two stages of the revolution, but we hardly really know them, and they're not really written in history textbooks even, right? So when I found Celia, she was already in prison for 10 years. When she was finally released, she was sent into exile because her husband was American, he can't go back to the US because he was a communist or in prison also. So they went to exile in London. So I went to find her in London, and I started to interview her. So actually, when I was doing my PhD in history, I didn't even know the techniques or this field of oral history. But then you have to train yourself, how to do oral history, right? Because I think in the social sciences, they would say qualitative history or interviews or participant observation. But for history, we have oral history, but also life history is really important, or biographies, right? So this is how we're able to capture the voices of the ones who were marginalized, right? So from Celia, I spent 1 year in my dissertation research just walking and trying to find all these women in Central and Southern Luzon, right? To the point that I was able to, it was so easy to find them. That's the thing, right? They're in plain view. They're still all there. Many of them are still involved in veterans, organizations or in peasant organizations, right? And so once I found them and talked to them about their lives, and I have these questions, and they're so generous and gracious to tell me about their life stories, right? So that was one of the first thing I did. And of course, the other thing is also looking at, actually that's the second, right? The first thing was looking at the archives, this Paul Beer documents, and trying to find, and I think, Kate, that's what you did, right? Looking and trying to find the women. And, so for me, even though all the captured documents were written by and for men, you are able to find women and ideas about gender and sexuality, right, and all that. So this is what I did, and finally, and I'll pass it on to Kate. So the last thing that I did was to, as Christine already said, was to look at newspapers, right? So, and it's really was, for me, it was really an eye opener, because even though we didn't know anything about the Hope women, when I went back to look at the newspapers during that time, there were so many newspaper articles written about them. So in fact, when people first found out about my book, they thought I was being so hyperbolic by calling them Amazons, right? Why did you call these women Amazons? And why did you, they think I'm just trying to, parang sensationalize by calling them Amazons. But actually, they were called Amazons. Right? So when I looked at all these newspapers in the 40s and 50s, and every time they talk about capturing a Hope woman, they would call them Amazon, Hope Amazon captured, Hope Amazon with baby. It's like, and that's when I realized they were Amazons, right? So I was kind of thinking, why were they called Amazon? So then all these other issues came by now, how do they connect, the term itself, and why did they call them, and where did this term come from, and then and how were they represented in newspapers and magazines, right? So based on all this different, information and research, and trying to find and piece everything together, trying to find, the voices of these women, I was able to, to write this book, which I feel that, part of the way I wrote this is to really give them, credit in terms of their role in history, right? I hardly changed. I did not change their names, only if they ask me, because I really want to put them in a historical record, so people know that there is a Celia Mariana Pomeroy, there is a Commander Liwayway, there is a Guerrero, these are the names of the people, and these are the women, and there were actual historical figures, and I want them to put them in historical record. And I think now I feel that most people have, especially historians, they already have an understanding that actually women were always been involved, right? I think that's the thing. Women, we've been involved in even the revolution against Spain, and then during the war and after the war, and of course, after that, with other women's organizations. But it is, it's both challenging to find these voices and to find these women, but it's very gratifying in the end. So.
For Dr. Lacson, she shared how her journey led her to finding these women that were hidden in plain sight.
So, totoo to, na parang I loved it when I heard Genevieve Clotario, I went to her online talk.
Yeah.
Na sabi niya, I'm not the strategic tawag niya, historian na ito lang yung titingnan ko. Sabi niya, I look at everything. Tapos sabi ko, nakarelate ako doon. Kasi para sa akin, bago ko mahanap yung mga kababaihan, kailangan mo talaga puntahan lahat ng dyaryo. So talagang binuklat ko lahat ng mga dyaryo na yon. And that's why, hindi ko kasi Nicolay masyado dito. Nicolay, I know you emailed me about the sources, right? And here's the thing, kasi parang sabi ko, wala akong oras sumagot nun pero masasagot kita ngayon. Kasi tama yan. Ito, perfect, no? Perfect. Kasi maganda yung question niya, nasan niyo nahanap yun? Diba? Parang yun yung sabi ko. First and foremost, ang unang kailangan yung buksan, yung mga na-available na nandito. Kasi sa akin na parang yung unang part ng search namin was to do the actual search. Wala kang ginagawa, punta ng archives, buksan mo, nandun sila. Paunti-unti. Kasi ayoko, I could just tell you, nandito yan sa dyaryo na to, etc., etc. But I don't want to say that and then you not gaining I think you're all historians or at least enthusiasts, no? Yung joy na pag nakita mo, holy cow, that's the eureka moment. Kasi nga ang hirap nilang hanapin. Pero pag natuto na yung mata mo kung paano sila hanapin, mabubulaga ka sa langit.
The joy of finding women leads to more discoveries for Dr. Lacson, who shared some of her techniques in finding women from various archives.
So that was what happened. And at the start, when I was doing my PhD, Spanish period, I went to Spain to get materials. Hindi ko sila mahanap sa unahan. Wala sila. Ang hirap hanapin. Pero yun nga, parang hanapin mo yung mga words, mujeres. Alam mo yun yung lahat ng konektado sa babae. I'm just giving you hints, no, how to do this, no? Bigla silang sumusulpot. Tapos even at the weirdest places, sumusulpot sila. By the time I went to the Library of Congress, alam ko na kung paano sila lahat hanapin. To the point that I ended up thinking that I wouldn't get materials. I ended up with 28,000 images, articles, text. And so that's why, instead of finishing it in 3 years, I had to have an extra year just to do database management. Now the information management.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so as you can see, hindi lahat ng ginawa ko, parang, dati kasi hindi ko makita, parang walang connection lahat ng ginawa ko sa buhay ko. With history, it all came together na parang, okay, this is the reason. So, you'll find them in plain sight. But we're so used to them being in plain sight that they become invisible. So you have to take off the glasses of, parang si Superman lang yan. Nasa harap mo na si Clark Kent, hindi mo pa nakita. Which is the same with women. So I think with that, they're everywhere. Na parang biglang, the images are there.
Both Dr. Lanzona and Dr. Lacson encountered challenges in their search for women. After all, the discipline of history has long been rooted in patriarchal perspectives. Let's hear them reflect on the struggles they face in uncovering women's voices.
Diba? It's usually, I mean, it's also the nature. Oh, sorry. It's also the nature. I mean, I don't want to interrupt you, but it's also the nature of the historical discipline and who writes this history.
That's
Diba?
right.
Parang, especially in in the Philippines, parang, and not just in the Philippines, like it's always
Yes.
been a kind of male dominated,
Yes.
discipline and field, right? So tapos parang even the fact na if you're working on women, you don't actually get the respect na parang they always think that if you do something on women or women's history that you're just filling in the gaps yung ganyan. So parang okay, this is a study on revolution, right? So these are actually the reasons why these revolutions occur. Tapos magkakaroon ka lang ng section on, okay, what did the women do? Pero the whole framework was already something dictated by men, because men are always in the leadership, so they're the ones who could kind of explain, why we rebelled and why we failed and all that, right? Pero once kaya nga it's not just women or women's studies that are important. It's also having an understanding of gender, right? Understanding na these types of the gendering of all this kind of politics, right? Because once you have an understanding of gender, then you and you incorporate gender in your studies, and not just incorporating women. Kasi diba, that's the challenge of us women historians. We just don't want to say na, okay, this is the whole, like historical event, right? And this is what women do. But then if you have an understanding of the gendering of these historical events, then everything changes. You have to have a different perspective, right? Parang, so in fact, that's how gender studies also developed, from women's studies. So you have to have an understanding. And when you think about gender, it's not just about women, gender is about femininity and masculinity, and the whole reason why certain women, like women and men, for example, when they join movements or when they do things, they approach it in different ways because of their own understanding of their roles, right? So parang that's how, that's why when you say that parang they're just there, right? But we think that they're marginalized, we don't see them. It's because we've been, like parang conditioned, to think na whatever they were doing were just kind of peripheral or not as important, right, than what the men were doing. So that's why, the way that you said na you have to give value to what they did, whether they were just, like in the movement, whether they were just washing clothes or just even that idea, I mean, that's really important, right? It's really important na who are the ones feeding the guerrillas, right? That's important, parang giving value to their work. So your whole understanding really changes when you have that perspective, right?
Tsaka plus yun nga, parang sa akin yung love to lipat, that Brodelian aspect of it, that the women are actually there every day. And there's the story of every day. Diba? Yung so kaya sa akin parang, for those who come in, there's really a part, sometimes we're prejudiced pa na parang sabihin sa'yo, ay, women history. Parang ganyan.
Exactly. Yeah.
Talaga lang. Di ba parang
They think it's not as rigorous as just history,
Na parang sa akin, mas mahirap yung ginawa namin kasi mas mahirap hanapin yung mga storya na kailangan namin isulat. It's harder, right? So, but yun nga, parang we just keep on, again, ito na parang yung going against the wave, and hopefully at some point, it becomes hindi one chapter, but it becomes really just part of the story. It does become really part of the story, and we have to be part of that. Kasama tayo doon. Hanapin sa araw-araw na mga storya. Because the women are there. The women are there. In the artifacts, in the products, in the, yun nga, like even yung simple tinignan ko lang na isang araw, that orange juice, hindi ko alam kung Dole ba yun or whatever, actually sa likod, ang measurement ng recommendation towards men, not women. So yung mga ganon, di ba, na parang the stories of women are there, pero palaging parang, nauna-una yung lalaki, nakatago yung babae, pero hindi porket nakatago yung babae, hindi importante yung trabaho niya.
For Dr. Lacson, The archives offer clues, but the process requires persistence and creativity.
Did you go to American Historical Collection? Open materials there because it's a treasure trove. Did you go to ALiWW? Did you go to the microfilm? Because your power is primary sources. And they're all over the place. Dito pa lang yun. Wala pa yung nasa labas. So,
Yeah,
people,
go to the actual women
to the
rin,
action-
of course.
and then yung pa yun nila, parang sabi ko nga na, ano ba doon yan? Hindi kailangang mahirap. Kasi pwede namang joyful muna siya eh, na parang, if you don't know what you want to do, because I'm sure lahat kayo gagawa ng thesis. Dadaan kayo sa aming lahat. Kaya na, diba? Magsimula kayo, tingnan niyo muna yung nandyan, without any kasi ang sarap pag yung leisurely yung start ng research eh. Yun yung parang feeling ko that was the joy, na parang that also brought us in, I'm sure, di ba? Na parang there was the joy of, ay, ang galing, uy, hindi ko alam the discovery itself. And then before you know it, you're hooked. Ganyan, di ba? Kasi your story. So,
For scholars here in the Philippines, we are fortunate to have the Ateneo Library of Women's Writings, ALiWW, which archives the various contributions of women in our Philippine history. With over 200 women from various fields, their materials highlight how women were also integral members of Philippine society and led intersectional lives that captured their complex contributions and nature as women. Dr. Lacson acknowledges the complexity of women in our discussion.
and to add kasi di ba parang we always seem to think pag women pinag-uusapan ng suffragettes, di ba? Parang, and I think that's why nga, maraming
Kababaihan.
kailangang isulat. Hindi lang siya political history. Ang daming, this one is a very good example. Wala, kung dito nasulat, wala. Hindi mo malalaman na may ganong storya. Beauty pageants, alam mo, ang daming storya ng kababaihan. Hindi lang nationalist or political. I'm not saying, mas marami lang nakasulat na gano'n eh. Pero ang dami pang economic, legal, social, cultural, na pwedeng pagbigyan ng pansin.
Yeah.
From poets to scientists to mothers, the women of ALiWW showcases how we cannot neglect the presence of women and how, when unchallenged, patriarchal structures can silence their voices. In the discussion, Dr. Lanzona and Dr. Lacson speak of keeping an open mind to be able to see these women. What can these archival materials say, or are not saying, about women's lives in the past? For researchers and students who wish to know more about some of the materials these scholars have used from ALiWW's archives, you can view the collection of Dr. Vina Lanzona at ALiWW. This collection contains her interviews of over 50 women who were part of the Hook Rebellion. Her collection showcases the importance of women's oral history in the Philippines. Meanwhile, Dr. Lacsona's work on the American period is best exemplified by the collection of Encarnacion Alzona. She's the first woman who received a PhD and is the first Filipina historian. Her collection at ALiWW is the largest, and of course, it contains a very rich collection of the lives and stories of women during the American and even the post-war period. We hope that you can visit us at ALiWW and view these materials and see the different ways these women have shaped our past. We'd like to thank Dr. Lanzona and Dr. Lacson in sharing their insights on how to find women in our history. We hope that in listening to Dr. Lanzona and Dr. Lacson, you were inspired to open your minds and seek the presence and contributions of women in Philippine history. The Ateneo Library of Women's Writings is a beautiful start for your interest. Hopefully, as you find joy in your research at ALiWW, you will also find joy in discovering the legacies of women. Before we go, a quick reminder. ALiWW's exhibit, Legacies of Pearls, will continue from January 3 to January 31, 2025 at the 5th floor of the Rizal Library and the ALiWW Reading Room. We hope you can drop by and experience these rich collections firsthand. As we end this program, I would like to greet you all the happiest of holidays and the happiest new year ahead. As the year comes to an end, we at ALiWW would like to thank you all for supporting our projects and listening to our podcast. We hope to see you in our future episodes and, of course, at ALiWW. Good night, and we hope to see you next year.